Every night, without fail, she walked slowly to the window as if returning to a place too familiar to be forgotten. It wasn't curiosity, it wasn't conscious hope, and much less expectation. It was an automatic, almost unconscious gesture, like breathing before sleep. The city was already silent. The distant lights flickered aimlessly, and the cold glass reflected a face that was learning to pretend it was all right. Anyone looking from the outside would think she was observing the world, but the truth was different. She was confirming, night after night, the absence that was never officially announced. That window didn't show streets, it showed memories. It didn't show people, it showed possibilities that didn't happen. And perhaps, without realizing it, she wasn't expecting someone to arrive. She was hoping the pain would finally go away. What she didn't know, and the viewer even less, is that while she believed she was alone in this silent wait, there was someone, at another point in time and life, repeating the same emotional ritual, waiting in the most difficult way, unseen, unremembered, but never giving up. At first, she told herself it was just a silly habit, a reflection of old days, when life still seemed predictable, like someone unlocking their phone for no reason, waiting for a notification that never arrives. She would approach the window just to make sure nothing had changed. The love that passed through there didn't end with fights or broken promises. It simply hung in the air, like a sentence interrupted halfway through. And unfinished sentences echo louder than final goodbyes. Over time, the waiting stopped hurting sharply and began to hurt silently, constantly, like background noise that we learn to ignore. She continued living, working, smiling in photos, saying everything was fine. But every night at that same time, her body remembered what her mind was trying to erase. The window became the only place where she didn't have to pretend to be over it. There, no one demanded explanations. No one asked her to hurry. It was just her, the cold glass, and the strange feeling that something wasn't over yet, even when everything around insisted on moving on. She used to say she had learned to move on, but moving on, in that case, meant only learning not to talk about it anymore. The silence became an elegant armor, praised by those who saw from the outside and too heavy for the one who carried it inside. Friends said that time heals everything, as if time were an automatic remedy and not a mirror that magnifies what we avoid facing. And every night when the house finally became quiet, the past found space to breathe. The window wasn't a plea for a return. It was a question without an answer. It was there that she allowed herself to remember the tone of voice, the specific way of laughing, the conversations interrupted by commitments that seemed too urgent at that time. She wasn't waiting for a person, she was waiting for an explanation. Because when love goes away without explanation, it doesn't go away whole. A part remains, taking up space, demanding meaning. And while she believed that looking out the window was just a harmless habit, it was actually a silent agreement with herself, not to completely close a door that was never officially locked. On the other side of this story, there was someone who also believed they were living, but were merely surviving their days. He didn't have a specific window, but he carried the waiting in small, invisible gestures. It was on the way home, when passing by places he no longer frequented. It was when listening to songs that he quickly skipped, afraid of remembering too much. Unlike her, he didn't allow himself clear rituals, because believing he was still waiting seemed like weakness. And so, he transformed longing into discipline. He convinced himself that loving in silence was maturity, that not insisting was respect, that not searching was proof of character. But the heart doesn't understand codes of pride. While he continued accumulating days without news, he carried the constant feeling of having left something unfinished behind. Like someone who leaves home forgetting to turn off the light and spends the whole day with the impression that something went wrong. He also moved forward but too straight, ignoring the emotional detour that was never resolved. And unknowingly, while she looked outside every night, he looked inside, trying to convince himself that waiting, even unseen, was still a form of love. Time, which many call the villain, began to act as a silent teacher for the two of them. It didn't teach with answers, it taught with absences. She tried new paths, new conversations, even new affections, but there was always an involuntary comparison, a detail that didn't fit, not because the past was perfect, but because it was true. He, in turn, almost made definitive decisions. He thought about moving to another city, about accepting opportunities that would distance him even further from what was already distant. On some days he believed that starting over meant erasing everything. On others he understood that certain stories don't ask for forgetting, they ask for courage. The truth is that both confused waiting with stagnation, when in reality they were being prepared. Like someone who leaves a book closed for years and, upon opening it again, understands the story in a completely different way. Life continued to test them both, not to punish them, but to reveal who they had become apart. And each night by the window, each day of silence on the other side, brought closer an inevitable moment, the moment when waiting would cease to be a habit and would become a choice. There was one particular night when something almost imperceptible changed inside her. Nothing extraordinary happened outside. The street was empty. The wind moved the trees in the same way as always, and no different shadow crossed the sidewalk. Yet, her heart reacted as if it had heard a call. For the first time, she didn't go to the window just to confirm the absence, but to confront the waiting itself. It was as if the silence had finally asked a direct question. How long will you pretend this doesn't matter anymore? Many people live like this, keeping feelings in a draft state, afraid to write the final sentence. She realized that she no longer looked out the window for him, but for who she became when she allowed herself to feel. The waiting wasn't about the past. It was about identity. Who was she without that completely resolved story? At that moment, something broke. Not her heart, but the comfortable lie that everything was already over. And when a person stops lying to themselves, the world begins to respond in unexpected ways. Meanwhile, on the other side of that invisible line that separates two lives, he lived a seemingly ordinary day that carried a different weight. The feeling was that of someone who reaches the end of a road that is too long and realizes they no longer know why they kept walking. He tried to rationalize, as he always did. He told himself that some stories exist only to teach, not to continue, but his body disagreed. The tightness in his chest didn't come from the memory, it came from the omission. He understood, perhaps too late, that waiting is not the same as acting, and that silence is not synonymous with respect when the feeling still exists. How many people lose love not for lack of feeling, but for excessive caution? That day, he did something simple, almost ridiculous to an outside observer. He wrote a message he never had the courage to send. It wasn't long, it wasn't perfect, it didn't ask for anything. It was simply true. And even without pressing the send button, that gesture changed everything. Because for the first time in a long time, he stopped waiting like someone hiding, and started waiting like someone ready to be seen. The curious thing is that life often aligns important decisions with small signs, almost like a test of emotional attention. That same night, she didn't immediately move away from the window. She stayed there a few seconds longer, feeling something difficult to name, a mixture of apprehension and mature expectation. It wasn't youthful anxiety. It was awareness. The awareness that some answers only appear when we accept the risk of hearing them. She thought about all the times she believed she was strong, simply by not showing what she felt. She thought about how many emotional windows she had closed to avoid getting hurt again. And there, looking out, she realized that courage is not the absence of fear. It's a decision despite it. The waiting, until then passive, was beginning to transform into internal movement. Something was about to happen, not because fate decided to intervene, but because two people in silence were finally becoming who they needed to be for the reunion to be possible. And when that happens, time stops separating and starts guiding. The next morning, she woke up with the strange feeling that something had been rearranged inside, even though nothing was different on the outside. The day went on as usual, but the thought kept returning to that night, to the way she lingered a few extra seconds by the window, as if she had missed an important sign in the past and didn't want to repeat the mistake. Throughout her life, she had learned to associate maturity with renunciation, as if loving less was synonymous with growing up. But growing up, at that moment, seemed to require something else: emotional honesty. She realized that it wasn't the waiting that held her back, but the fear of confirming that she still cared. Many people prefer to believe they've moved on because admitting otherwise requires responsibility for the next step. And acknowledging a feeling is accepting that it demands action. For the first time in a long time, she didn't ask herself if he still thought about her. She asked if she was willing to face the answer, whatever it might be. This subtle shift, from curiosity to responsibility, completely transformed the meaning of waiting. It wasn't about someone coming back anymore. It was about her not continuing to run away from herself. He, in turn, spent the entire day with that unsent message echoing like an unfinished conversation. Each typed word had been a silent confession. There were no promises, no demands, just the naked truth of someone who had grown tired of being strong alone. He understood something that took him years to learn. Pride doesn't protect the heart, it only isolates it. How many love stories are lost not because of serious mistakes, but because of silences that last too long? As he walked through the streets, he remembered who he was before trying to control everything. He remembered when he believed that feeling was more important than appearing to be in control. The waiting he had cultivated for so long began to seem incomplete without action, not because he demanded a happy ending, but because he deserved an honest ending. At the end of the day, holding his cell phone, he realized that the fear of bothering someone was less than the regret of never trying. Life doesn't demand absolute certainties. It demands presence. And in that instant, he understood that waiting can also be an act of courage, as long as it's not a hiding place. That night, the window seemed different, even though it was the same as always. She approached with a more awakened heart, less automatic. The glass reflected not only her face, but the silent decision that was maturing inside. She thought about how we spend years waiting for external signs, when in fact, the most important sign happens internally. Waiting only becomes painful when we surrender to time the responsibility that is ours. And there, before the window, she did something simple, yet definitive. She stopped waiting for answers she never asked for. She understood that some stories don't continue because someone made a mistake, but because no one dared to ask. Love, when it's real, isn't sustained only by memories. It needs presence, even if fragile, even if imperfect. That window, which for so long had been a point of observation, was beginning to transform into a point of passage. Something was about to break through, not necessarily someone, but the courage she had postponed for too long. And when courage breaks through first, the rest finds its way. It was then that life, with its silent irony, decided to test that newfound courage. The next day, she left work a little later and chose a different route home, not for a clear reason, but on impulse. That kind of impulse we tend to ignore when we're too busy trying to be rational. As she crossed the street, she felt a strange shiver, as if time had slowed down for just a few seconds. It wasn't romantic expectation. It was emotional recognition. That rare feeling of being in the right place without knowing why. Many important stories begin like this, not with grand signs, but with small breaks in routine. She realized that waiting doesn't always mean standing still. Sometimes it means walking to where the encounter might happen. And as she walked without imagining what was to come, she carried a new truth in her heart. If love still existed, it wouldn't survive on memories alone. It would need presence. It would need risk. It would need finally to be lived in the present moment. He had also changed his route that day, not by planning, but because he felt that continuing to do everything the same way was a disguised form of giving up. The world hadn't conspired. There were no mystical signs in the sky, just a simple decision, not to return home immediately. As he passed through familiar places, He realized how certain memories lose their weight when we stop running away from them. Waiting in silence taught him a lot, but it also tired him. The love he felt wasn't fragile, it was too patient. And patience without movement becomes distance. As he walked, he thought about how many times he let fear choose for him. Fear of seeming vulnerable, fear of being rejected, fear of discovering that time had truly changed everything. But he also understood that not trying was a premature rejection. The wait that is worthwhile is not the one that paralyzes, it's the one that prepares for the encounter. And at that moment, without knowing it, his steps were approaching exactly the point where the past and the present were about to meet. When they saw each other, there was no dramatic music, no exaggerated gestures. There was silence. A silence different from the one that had separated them. It was a silence laden with recognition, as if both needed a few seconds to accept that the waiting finally had a face before them. She felt her heart race not from anxiety, but from clarity. He realized that all the words rehearsed for years were unnecessary at that moment. Time, which had previously seemed like an enemy, now served as a witness. How many nights by the window? How many days of silence? How many postponed decisions converged in that simple instant? They didn't meet as two people trapped in the past, but as two people transformed by it. The waiting hadn't left them empty. It had made them more aware. And in that shared gaze, without promises, without demands, there was something stronger than any belated explanation. The silent certainty that neither of them had truly given up. They were simply learning to arrive at the right moment. The conversation came later, without haste, without the need to fix everything at once. They talked about what they had experienced apart, what had hurt, what had matured. Some answers came late, others came exactly when they were needed. She understood that not all separation is abandonment. He understood that not all silence is strength. The love that resurfaced there was not the same as before. It was calmer, more conscious, less idealized, and precisely for that reason, more true. The waiting, which for so long seemed like a mistake, revealed itself to be a process, like a bridge being built on both sides, without either knowing if the other was still working. When they finally met in the middle, they realized they weren't late, they were ready. Because happy endings don't happen when two people meet too soon, but when they meet whole, and there, in that simple and real reunion, the window ceased to be a place of waiting, and transformed into a reminder of everything that needed to happen so that love could finally stay. After that encounter, nothing needed to be labeled immediately. They didn't promise eternities or try to recover lost time like someone racing against an imaginary clock. What existed there was something rarer, conscious presence. She realized that for the first time, she didn't feel the need to rush back home and look out the window that night. Not because she had stopped waiting, but because the waiting had shifted. Now she was no longer trapped by the cold glass. She was alive in the real experience. Many people believe that happy endings begin with big decisions, but in reality, they begin when anxiety diminishes. Love that matures doesn't demand constant proof. It sustains itself in the tranquility of knowing where one is. And at that stage, they both understood that they didn't need to watch each other emotionally. There were no games, no strategies. Just two people relearning to walk together, with slower but firm steps. The window, which had previously symbolized absence, began to lose its emotional function, becoming just part of the house and no longer of the heart. As the days passed, small things began to have a different weight. Simple conversations gained depth. Silences ceased to be threatening. She realized she no longer needed to interpret every gesture, every word as she had done before. Clarity replaced anxiety. He, in turn, felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Emotional freedom, not the freedom to be alone, but the freedom not to have to hide. The love that resurfaced there didn't demand perfection, it demanded truth. And that made all the difference. How many relationships deteriorate because people arrive carrying idealized versions of themselves? They arrived with visible scars, incomplete stories, but also with the willingness not to repeat old patterns. The wait taught limits, taught patience, taught listening. And now these lessons were becoming a foundation. The reunion didn't erase the past. It reorganized it. Like someone who finally understands why they needed to go through certain paths before finding the right destination. There was a night, weeks later, when she realized something symbolic. She was at home. The day had been peaceful, and for the first time in a long time, time passed without her remembering the window. There was no resistance, no nostalgia, just forgetfulness. And that didn't mean loss. It meant healing. Some emotional scars don't disappear with big events, but with the repetition of good days. She understood that waiting wasn't a mistake, but remaining waiting after the reunion would be. Love now demanded continuity, not vigilance. He, sitting beside her, spoke of simple plans, nothing grandiose, possible trips, ordinary weekends, future laughter. And that was exactly what made everything special. Love that survives time doesn't need to be extraordinary all the time. It needs to be constant. And there in that everyday setting, it was clear that the happy ending wasn't a dramatic endpoint, but the silent construction of something that finally made sense. When she looked out the window again, days later, it wasn't out of longing or habit. It was out of gratitude. She saw the same ordinary street, the same lights, the same external silence. But inside, everything was different. The waiting had served its purpose. It wasn't just him who never stopped waiting. It was her too, even when she thought she had given up. Some love stories don't shout, don't rush, don't demand public proof. They endure. They grow in silence. They align at the right time. And when she closed the curtain that night, she didn't feel like she was closing a chapter. She felt like she was finally living the whole story. Because true love doesn't arrive to fill empty spaces. It arrives when we learn to stop looking out the window and start looking inward, ready to stay. As time passed, their story ceased to be marked by memories of what almost happened and began to be built on what was finally happening. There was no longer a need to revisit old pains to validate the present. The love that now existed needed no justification, because it didn't come from neediness but from choice. She realized something essential. For years, she believed that waiting was a sign of weakness, when in fact it was what kept her connected to her own truth. Waiting didn't prevent her from living. It only prevented her from getting lost in versions that weren't hers. He also recognized that the distance wasn't a punishment, but a process of maturation. If they had insisted before, perhaps they would have broken up. Time didn't separate to punish. It separated to prepare. And this awareness brought a rare peace, one that doesn't depend on future promises, only on the coherence between feeling and acting in the present. In a simple, almost unassuming conversation, they talked about waiting for the first time without any weight. They laughed at how they both believed they were alone in that process, when in fact they were walking in parallel circles. How many people live like that, believing that no one is waiting for them while someone, in silence, sustains exactly that feeling? Life didn't warn them that it was the right time, didn't sound alarms, didn't offer guarantees. It just created space. And they learned that love doesn't demand absolute certainties, it demands emotional availability. Being available is harder than appearing strong, because availability involves risk, involves possible rejection, involves losing control of the narrative. But it's also there that life truly happens. The waiting ceased to be a solitary territory and transformed into a shared memory, something that united them, instead of separating them. There was a day when she spoke, naturally, about the nights she spent by the window, not as a sad confession but as part of her own story. He listened in silence, not with guilt, but with respect. He understood that this simple gesture carried years of unresolved feelings. And instead of promising he would never make her wait again, he did something more honest. He promised not to disappear. Because no one can guarantee the future, but they can guarantee presence. This silent commitment is worth more than any grand declaration. Mature love doesn't promise perfect endings. It promises possible continuity. And at that moment it became clear that happiness wasn't in erasing the past, but in integrating it without pain. The window, which had previously symbolized absence, now represented resistance. Resistance from someone who didn't give up on feeling, even when everything seemed to demand the opposite. In the end, their story didn't become extraordinary in the eyes of the world, and perhaps that's why it was true. There were no applause, no cinematic scenes. There was constancy. There was daily choice. There were two hearts that learned, perhaps late, but at the right time, that love is not urgency, it is sustained presence. And if someone asks when it all began again, she may not know how to answer, because it didn't begin with a meeting nor with a message sent. It began on all those nights when she looked out the window and, without realizing it, kept alive the capacity to love. Some people never stop waiting because deep down they know that certain stories don't end. They just wait for the moment when both sides are ready to stay. And that, finally, was the happy ending. Not the end of the waiting, but the meeting of two people who learned to stay. And when everything finally seemed to be settling into its right place, she realized something she had never been able to see before. The waiting wasn't an empty interval in life. It was an essential part of its construction. Each night by the window shaped how she learned to listen to her own silence, to respect her own rhythm, to not accept loves that demanded she diminish herself. The story she was now living didn't erase the past pain, but it gave it meaning. How many people spend their entire lives trying to erase difficult chapters without understanding that it is precisely these chapters that sustain true happy endings? The love she found didn't come to fill a void. It came to walk alongside someone whole. And that made all the difference. Because when two people meet complete, love ceases to be a need and becomes a conscious, daily, peaceful choice. He also understood in silence that he never stopped waiting because he never stopped believing. Even on the days when he tried to force himself to move on, something inside him remained faithful to that story. Not out of attachment, but out of emotional truth. The waiting didn't paralyze him. It prepared him to love without haste, without dangerous idealizations, without empty promises. Looking at her now, present, real, he realized that everything that didn't happen before needed not to happen. Some connections require time to mature, like roots that grow far from the surface before sustaining something strong enough to last. And there, without speeches, without needing to explain the past to the world, they lived something simple and rare, shared peace. The kind of peace that only exists when there is no more internal escape. And when everything finally seemed to be settling into its right place, she realized something she had never been able to see before. The waiting wasn't an empty interval in life. It was an essential part of its construction. Each night by the window shaped how she learned to listen to her own silence, to respect her own rhythm, to not accept loves that demanded she diminish herself. The story she was now living didn't erase the past pain, but it gave it meaning. How many people spend their entire lives trying to erase difficult chapters, without understanding that it is precisely these chapters that sustain true happy endings? The love she found didn't come to fill a void. It came to walk alongside someone whole. And that made all the difference. Because when two people meet complete, love ceases to be a need and becomes a conscious, daily, peaceful choice. He also understood in silence that he never stopped waiting because he never stopped believing. Even on the days when he tried to force himself to move on, something inside him remained faithful to that story. Not out of attachment, but out of emotional truth. The waiting didn't paralyze him. It prepared him to love without haste, without dangerous idealizations, without empty promises. Looking at her now, present, real, he realized that everything that didn't happen before needed not to happen. Some connections require time to mature, like roots that grow far from the surface before sustaining something strong enough to last. And there, without speeches, without needing to explain the past to the world, they lived something simple and rare, shared peace. The kind of peace that only exists when there is no more internal escape. If there's one thing this story reveals, it's that not all waiting is a sign of loss. Sometimes it's a sign of fidelity to what we truly feel. We live in a time that teaches us to quickly replace, to discard emotions that last longer than expected. But some stories don't work at the pace of haste. They require silence, maturity, long pauses, and conscious reunions. Looking out the window in the end was never about waiting for someone to arrive. It was about not closing your heart prematurely. And when she finally stopped waiting the old way, she found love the right way. Not as a savior, not as an exaggerated promise, but as real company for ordinary days, which are, in the end, where life truly happens. Perhaps you, who are listening to this story, also have an invisible window, an inner place where you revisit feelings that were never fully resolved. Perhaps you think waiting makes you weak when in fact it makes you honest. True love doesn't obey external calendars. It respects processes, and when it arrives, it doesn't arrive making noise. It arrives staying. This story isn't about two people who met again by chance. It's about two people who never gave up on feeling, even when everything seemed to demand forgetting. And that's why, when they finally met, they didn't need to rush. They just stayed. If this story touched something inside you, don't ignore that feeling. Write in the comments what you still hope for, or what you learned while waiting. Sometimes, someone will recognize themselves exactly in your words. And if you believe that some love stories don't end, they just mature, stay here. Other stories are still being prepared in due time to find you.